It's a momentous occasion. All aviation stops to watch.
Through the ages, the adventurous have risked their lives to cheat gravity.
Keep your eye on the birdie. Cuckoo, cuckoo.
They've used flapping wings, helicopters, balloons, and of course, aeroplanes. Perhaps if they had focused less on the small flapping birds and more on the soaring action of the larger ones, they may have flown long before they did. Then in 1903, on a cold December day in North Carolina, two brothers, Orville and Wilbur Wright, finally got us on that infinite highway of the air. What many people don't realize is that the next summer, in another state, the Wright brothers' plane refused to fly. That's because they had moved to a higher elevation where the air was thinner and the temperature a lot warmer. They had unwittingly stumbled onto the problem of high-density altitude. Hi, I'm Bruce Reichert, and welcome to Outdoor Idaho. What the Wright brothers encountered that summer of 1904 is a problem that every Idaho pilot eventually faces. Simply put, high-density altitude robs planes like this one of their ability to perform. Now, those early pilots, the ones who first rose to the challenge, not only learned to cope with that problem, but they helped usher in the age of aviation into the heart of the West. The first flying machine to thrill the people of Idaho took to the air in 1910 at the Lewiston-Clarkston Fair. Other pilots and their planes soon followed, popping up in small towns all over the state, advertising flying exhibitions and plane rides.
Barnstorming was flying to somebody's field, landing, and having people come out and selling them rides. That's what barnstorming is all about.
Gladys Baroker was one of Idaho's daredevils. She was barnstorming in 1934, parachuting from the high-flying Jennies.
I'd go up with one, the other one would take a load of passengers to watch me jump from the airplane. They were exciting days, but they were certainly meager income. I slept under the wing of the Swallow, and I lived on bread and bologna.
Barnstormers entertained people with the possibilities of flight, but it took the U.S. mail to put the flying machines to work. In 1926, Varney Airlines made history when its pilot, Leon Cuddyback, flew the first airmail route in the West. Male pilots were the most daring of flyers, and few lived to be old men. But even they skirted Idaho's rugged mountains. All this changed when the Stibnite mine had planes fly in supplies during the winter of 1929. Soon pilots were making daily runs into the mountains, hauling much-needed goods to remote ranches and mines. Promotional films like this one portrayed a thriving new business.
The Red Travel Air comes over from Boise almost every day. Over from Boise with fresh meat, canned goods, butter, and the morning paper. Over from Boise with a new cat skinner, fresh lettuce and fruit. Ike, the mountain pilot, comes over from Boise almost every day.
Enthusiastic customers had pilots carrying everything from machinery to horses. Pilots started their own businesses, like Bob Johnson's Flying Service. The demand also created stiff competition.
That was the most cutthroat business in the world, and the guy that was able to stick his neck out and make a trip when the other ones were sitting got the business. You know, they made it in the business, the other ones didn't. And Bob would fly weather that he had absolutely no business in doing to continue and make a success of Johnson Flying Service.
The fortunes of the Johnson Flying Service were closely tied to the U.S. Forest Service. In 1940, a Johnson pilot dropped the first smoke jumpers on a fire in central Idaho. a partnership was born, changing firefighting forever. World War II pushed aviation to newer heights. It also put women to work flying.
They needed the pilots, and there were quite a few women pilots throughout the United States. There were not enough men to fill the jobs that were necessary. And by the women flying and ferrying the aircraft, that would leave men for combat flying. I felt I would help the war effort some other way. I instructed both Army and Navy pilots, and all during the war, 7 days a week, 10 hours a day.
After the war, general aviation boomed. In Idaho, Chet Moulton became director of aeronautics. Under his leadership, the state built airstrips, pushed pilot safety, and produced promotional films about flying.
You've come across 3 mountain ranges and 2 forests, and you're in time for hotcakes. You're suddenly aware of the importance of food. You think about happiness and what it is. This is an Idaho air breakfast.
I always say that there's the most freedom involved in this type of flying. At the same time, it's the most precision of any flying you'll ever do, too. A lot of the places that it's a one-shot deal. You either do it right the first time or that could be the last time. You kind of throw the rule book out the window when you fly this backcountry.
Galen Hanselman is one of many pilots who continue the tradition of flying the backcountry.
It's worth it to be able to kind of get out of the system and to fly out of the radar environment and to find places where you can take an airplane and it kind of turns the clock back.
Galen's favorite refuge is along the middle fork of the Salmon River.
It's really a neat spot. It's located quite a ways from the boundaries of the wilderness area, so you feel like you're really in the middle of the wilderness when you're there.
Every Idaho pilot will tell you that the state's backcountry is unique. Wild mountains with tough little landing strips carved out on hillsides, mountaintops, and river bottoms. Galen became so enamored with the airstrips and the history of the backcountry that he wrote a guidebook about it.
Yeah, this hole holds some pretty good sized fish. They like these big old cutthroat, like these big deep holes like this in the shadows. When you tell people that, well, if you go to Indian Creek, you can hop in a boat and go down the river, or you can go fishing there, and there's some great history that took place, then, oh yeah, I'd kind of like to go up there. So it broadens that information that the people have to utilize the backcountry.
The book lists the attractions and the flying hazards for 68 different airstrips.
Oh, we warn them against badger holes on the runway and warn them against possible collisions with big animals like elk and moose and deer. And there's warnings against density altitude, and when the air heats up, it gets thinner and your airplane doesn't fly quite right.
Galen even created a hazard rating for the landing strips. But still, some pilots fear Galen's book will get flatland flyers in trouble.
They're probably right. You know, it has that hazard in that, you know, somebody could pick up the book and say, gee, this looks like a great spot. I've never flown the mountains, but I think I can get in there. But if you read the book, I really stress that this is only a primer. And throughout the book, I really encourage people to get personal instruction to fly it. There's some terrible strips in there. There's some strips I wouldn't encourage anybody to go into. But the fact remains that they are public strips. They're open to the public, and hopefully it will expand our base to protect those areas for future generations, to protect our aviation heritage for our children.
But in the 1960s, it was not the lack of skill that threatened to keep pilots from the airstrips. It was politics. Proposed wilderness designation banned all motorized equipment from wilderness areas. That included airplanes.
They were taking access away from the public.
Bill Doris was one of many pilots who fought back.
Well, I got a hold of Senator McClure, anybody that would listen to me that had any political clout. And I started singing the blues.
A political compromise preserved the use of wilderness airstrips, but it also created a new challenge: how to maintain the airstrips and obey the Wilderness Act. In the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, the Forest Service found a way to satisfy the conflicting demands. At Moose Creek, an antique mower clears a path for modern aircraft.
The law is pretty explicit in instructing us to manage with the minimum mechanized equipment necessary to administer it for the intent of wilderness. A motorized modern tractor isn't appropriate if you can use a horse-drawn mower to do it.
The Forest Service must also mediate between those who say wilderness and airplanes don't mix and pilots who say they have a right to use the airstrips.
Conflict in recreation management is conflict in values. And the airfield is an interface. We have the rafters that are floating the Selway, hikers, stock users, backcountry pilots, all come together right here.
And each comes with different expectations. Floaters expect solitude while pilots expect continued access, making conflict inevitable.
You can reduce the amount of use overall, or you can reduce a type of use that is more impacting than others. And I think it's very political.
The Idaho Aviation Association offered to help. Volunteers monitor the airstrips and urge backcountry pilots to modify their behavior.
The biggest complaint was people training in Moose Creek, like doing multiple landings and takeoffs. When we'd explain to them that, we really didn't want them to train back here, maybe one landing and one takeoff is plenty because there's a 4,000-foot runway here, and if you can't handle 4,000 feet, you shouldn't be back here anyway. It worked out real well.
It's a lot more credible and a lot easier for a pilot to talk with a pilot than it is for a uniformed federal employee to talk with a pilot. They know the language, they know the limitations of their equipment, and there's something in it for them. They know their tenure, their longevity here depends somewhat on the way they get along with other users.
And that is why pilots got involved. Wilderness airstrips are simply too valuable to lose.
The greatest hunting area in the world, in my opinion, is right here in central Idaho. And the only access for these hunters is to flying.
There are about 40 men and women in the state of Idaho who fly the backcountry for a living. Scott Patrick is one of them.
Okay, here we go. Airstrip's clear. I start dropping my flaps. I got my airspeed down under control. Then we'll bring her back till we hear the horn. Welcome to the Flying Bee.
Flying in river rafters and their supplies in the summer months is his busiest season, but this is his favorite, the fall hunt.
Hunting's my favorite season. I really like flying hunters. The air is cooler, the days get shorter, so we don't have to work as long hours. But we'll fly, 8 or 10 hours a day through the hunting season, total with all the airplanes in our operation. Some of the other operators, there's 4 or 5 other operators or 6 other operators that we compete with for those hunters, and a couple are a little bigger and a couple are a little smaller.
In the course of a typical working day, Patrick will travel about 600 miles, landing at public airstrips and private ones, like this one at Pistol Creek, near the Middle Fork of the Salmon River.
We've got a real unique deal. We've got 4 million acres of wilderness. It's the largest continuous wilderness area in the lower 48 states. And we've got a system of airports that are in place, and they'll stay in place to service, to access these wilderness areas. To have this many people in here without the roads and without the airstrip, the roads we obviously don't have, the trails will never be able to support these kinds of uses.
Tomorrow is the opening day of hunting season, and the hunting guides understand the importance of pilots to their own livelihood.
How's that look for Rocky Rock? I'll go, Marv. Unless they like to sit in the saddle for about 3 days, we wouldn't have much of a business at all. That's how we get our people in here, and we rely on them, and they kind of rely on us for business too. They're our lifeline, that's for sure. They bring us our groceries and our mail, and we're always happy to see them when they come in here.
The backcountry cowboys discovered this dog lost along the Middle Fork.
Jump in. How about that, huh? This little girl's a stray that showed up the ranch here about a week ago. And she was pretty thin. They fed her and fattened her up a little bit, but another tough part of the job, I'll take a dog to town, see if we can find an owner for her. She's a real nice dog. You know, this backcountry flying business is it's not a big money maker for anybody. I mean, you know, we all just kind of scrape by and keep our airplanes paid for. And where the reward is the fact that I get up and get to go do this every day. This is what I want to do, and that's the whole pay for me. That's the whole reason I do it is I enjoy it. And people ask me, do you ever get tired of flying? And I say, no, you know, I get tired of working, but I never get tired of flying.
When pilots run into problems in the backcountry, the results can be tragic. Human error is usually to blame. An inexperienced pilot takes off in the heat of the day and crashes, or takes a wrong turn up a short canyon, or a long-time mountain pilot simply pushes his luck in bad weather. Bob Plummer coordinates search and rescue efforts for downed and missing planes. He says too many pilots underestimate Idaho's mountains and overestimate their abilities.
And if it's the pilot, it's one thing. You know, he made the mistake and he did it to himself, but he's got 2 or 3 people on board with him that were totally innocent in the whole situation. And he's got a pilot's license. They figured he can do this.
Plummer wanted to be part of the solution, so he started a mountain flying seminar where skilled mountain pilots teach others to fly the backcountry too.
Most anybody can do it. They just need to have the patience to take the time to listen to somebody and not get cowboyish or hot dog-ish or whatever you want to call it, and just go do it themselves.
He says the main thing a pilot needs to learn is a plane's limitations, particularly since most of the planes are old, like his.
The airplane is 22 years old, going on 23 years old. It's working on its 8th engine. You know, it's got over 7,000 hours on it. It's not going to perform like a new airplane.
Take that out and
we cables for those, don't we?
That's where mechanics like Lenny Skunberg come in.
Heat and the mixture are all going, because we'll put in new, and they're going to be routed in a different place for the fuel injection.
Skunberg has been working on airplanes for 25 years.
Get that out of the way.
Much of that time has been spent on planes built in the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
That's really gotten to be a problem now, is the age of the fleet, because of the way society is, the litigation. There was no incentive to be selling airplanes. And so, you know, from that standpoint, we have to do a lot more care in watching on the birds that are starting to get a lot older and tired. We're talking, you know, 30-year-old airframes running around. And they're still doing a fantastic job, just that they need a little closer watching now and then.
It's not just the age of these airplanes that matters, but what they endure day in and day out.
We've kind of nicknamed a few of them throttle jockeys because they're just hard on equipment that way. You can tell when an airplane's been abused. The counterweights inside the engine are flattened and things like that. Okay, this particular one, this used in the backcountry, and we'll be paying a lot of attention to the gear on this. They get quite a workout up here in the gear castings where it's attached, the wheels and brakes. We've had those crack, the axles come loose, and so it needs to be watched, but they do a real good job what they're meant to do. They work real good.
In 1987, his mechanical expertise was rewarded when the FAA named him the nation's Maintenance Technician of the Year.
They'll do just about anything they're asked to do, especially like in the backcountry. Probably their weak point would be just overloading and density altitude problems and stuff like that the airplane just isn't capable of performing. But boy, they'll do just about anything you ask them as long as you do it properly.
Lori, let's go on into the office and kind of go over some of that stuff about Cabin Creek, and then we'll go out and fly. Okay?
Great.
Lynn Clark is the chief pilot for McCall Air Taxi. She's checking off fellow pilot Lori McNichol on a backcountry landing strip. The first step is ground school.
A lot of these airstrips are really pretty good, and under ideal conditions, most people with a reasonable amount of knowledge can land and take off and not have a problem.
So if you have a tendency to be too high on the first part and a tendency to be too low on the last part. We're slowed down to 60, about ready to cross the creek.
All of these airstrips have at least one gotcha. Most of that is local knowledge, and you need to find that out from someone who's been there.
Okay.
And Cabin Creek, as you see, it's not right at the confluence, it's up Cabin Creek.
In the air, a familiar landscape can quickly change into a maze of peaks and valleys. That's why a local pilot's knowledge is so important.
But there isn't anything right directly across from Ramey Creek, which makes it a little easier to identify. Okay, so this one right here is Ramey. That's Ramey. The next one is Crooked Creek.
When you're first starting out, it's really easy to get turned around because the canyons all look alike. And then after a while, you start finding specific landmarks. You'll see an old burn, or there'll be an airstrip at the mouth of a creek, and so you can recognize it that way.
20 November is passing Diamond Point out of 7.8.
At last, Lynn and Lori close in on Cabin Creek, and Lynn takes over the flying. First, she circles the landing strip to look for obstacles on the runway.
You know, in the spring, you're looking for wild animals. There are usually elk in here, but at this time of year, you're looking out for pack string. Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, you better make sure it's all in order before you turn on the final. Yeah, you do.
Once the pack string clears the airstrip, Lynn sets up for a final approach.
Okay, see the trees? I like to be right above the top of those, or close to the top of them as I come by. Okay. Now, it looks like we're kind of too high, but we're not.
You're real intensely focusing on what the other pilot is telling you, and little areas to look for, and possibly altitudes that you want to be at, or the tree or the rock that you're turning towards. You're getting all this logged into your memory so that when you go out and you do it yourself, you're going through this again and making that same approach.
Now it's Lori's turn to solo at Cabin Creek.
It's a no-go-around strip. There's one way in and one way out, and you need to pretty well have it together and be in the right place at the right time on the approach. The strip itself isn't particularly difficult, but the approach is rather deceiving because of the terrain. It's just sort of easy to mess up in here. Okay, coming on down, looks good, looks good. Oops, come on, get a little power so you don't drop it. That a girl.
It was fun when you finally got it just about right and knew you were going to touch down, and very exhilarating. It was great.
Among backcountry pilots, there's a saying. There are old pilots and there are bold pilots, but there are few old, bold pilots. Mountain flying is not for the weak at heart. It's a specialized kind of flying with its own set of rules. But for those who master the intricacies and learn to respect the limitations, there's nothing else quite like it in the world. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.